building or operating physical things. So I mainly took courses in theory, which fit my aptitude because I wanted to succeed there. And I became fascinated with the principles of science and the scientific method. And then that carried over after I left MIT and went to work, that I developed a passion for not only furthering that understanding, but developing an understanding for what I call the principles of human flourishing. And this wasn't just to understand these principles. It was, I wanted to be successful, I wanted to accomplish things, so I had to learn it in a way that would enable me to apply it in a way that would make me more effective. So my studies included the full range of everything I thought would be relevant and would help me. That is, the full range of different ideas, different disciplines, different ideologies. And then I could sort this out and see when a principle would help me or how it needed to be modified, and then I would try to apply it in all the aspects of my life and see what worked and didn't and modified it. And what I learned from this changed my life and enabled me to accomplish more than I ever dreamed possible. And probably just as important as that, or maybe more important, it gave me a much deeper purpose in life and a North Star. And just to not take the whole time on this, it was to move toward a society where everyone has the opportunity to become engaged, and engaged in a way that they could realize their potential. And this would be what I call a society of mutual benefit, where people succeed by helping each other rather than is the case too often by hurting others or taking advantage of others.
Mm-hmm. And you applied this not only to your philanthropy, but also to your business practice. Say something about that.
To my business practice and my family. My kids can give horror stories on what they had to endure. But yeah, in business, I took these principles and started trying to develop a management framework that we call market-based management. And then to apply that to create what I call virtuous cycles of mutual benefit. That is, to think rather than as I've given talk at business schools, and I start talking about the way you need to start is understand and develop the capability to create value for others. And the students would argue, no, you're supposed to be maximizing profit. That's naive. And I ask, well, is that more naive, or think somebody's going to want to pay you something or work with you if you're not creating value for them? But anyway, that isn't the place to go as business schools, unfortunately. So with a virtuous cycle of mutual benefit then is understanding how you can create value for all your constituencies. The first being, of course, your customers, but also your employees, your suppliers, your communities, and society at large, and to become what I call the partner of choice. So when people of all these constituents have a range of people they can deal with, they prefer to deal with you, and then continually improve these, add capabilities, find new opportunities, and so on. So that's what I mean by virtuous cycles of mutual benefit. And miraculously, all this worked pretty well. I mean, we had a lot of failures, and that's the other thing. You've got to be willing to have failures, to experiment, to constantly try new things, and be open to different ideas and different ways of doing things. And so that's why at 83, I'm more passionate and working harder than ever, because I have these fabulous ideas, I think, which I like to see implemented and benefit other people besides myself.
Yeah. So in many ways, this year, you're thinking about business as a precursor to the concept of shared value, advanced by a Harvard guy, Michael Porter, not an MIT guy.
Sure.
But the notion of making...
we worked with Michael Porter
for a while. Great. So you've touched on kind of two levers you use to advance social change or social good. One is your business and the other is your philanthropy. Brian, it's your job to execute on these concepts, concepts of liberty and equality and very sort of deeply American concepts. Tell me what are the quivers in your bow as you do this?
Well, it really comes back to that idea of how do we work with others to create these virtuous cycles of mutual benefit. So when we can help to address a problem in society, we don't just address that problem, but we empower people to go on to address problems further. And so everything that we do a whole lot of different things, as you say, but it all comes back to partnership.
Yeah.
And it's the people that we work with. So we are fortunate to be able to work, as many of you are, in our case, with literally thousands of social entrepreneurs, people who are discovering new and better ways to solve societal problems. And those social entrepreneurs take many forms. There are all sorts of different people, all sorts of different perspectives. They include hundreds of business leaders and philanthropists, for sure. Every year we have partnerships with people in the business world and the philanthropic community, but we also have partnerships with people who bring just a very different perspective to solving problems. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you want to address violence in urban communities, we've found the best people to partner with are former gang leaders. And we've got programs that support wonderful organizations that are accomplishing incredible things in communities based on what folks like our partners know that we could never know. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to address addiction, right? We work with people who have experienced addiction. Homelessness, we work with people who have experienced homelessness.
Or just to add to that, or have the credibility. We come in and tell them how to solve these problems. I mean, right. What you haven't lived through this, whereas our partners have lived through it, overcame the problems, and so people will listen to them, and rightfully so. They shouldn't be listening to me.
And that's the key, right? Often what we found, and I'm sure this resonates, many people in this room have had similar experiences, but the wisdom and the knowledge to help us know where we can actually make the biggest difference, more often than not, comes from the people on the front lines who are actually experiencing those problems and have that local knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so the partnerships that we work with are the common thread through all of the different activities and programs and people that we support. And then once you've got those partnerships in place, you've got to tackle problems from all different angles. And that really is what we found is critical. Rarely have we found a societal problem where there's a single intervention that can solve it and then you're done, right? And this, I think the previous panel was talking about the need to invest across society, empower people across society in order to really sustainably address any one problem.
Yeah.
So we invest across education, communities, help business to play a more productive role in society, and as well as public policy.
So you say you weren't a great engineer, but it sounds like you are a great engineer. That is to say that you take a systems approach to a problem, and a big part of that is having the right partnerships. So I don't think you're going to get away with saying you're not a good engineer.
Terrible. Sorry. I was terrible. I avoided all the application courses.
You just like the theory.
Yeah. Well, no, then you apply it, but this is the way I apply it is more in what's the vision, should the philosophy be, how should we organize around it, rather than using it to make or operate physical things.
Yeah. So it strikes me, Brian, that you've got the layer of a foundation, and there you are doing something that so many foundations do, and that's investing in ideas. You used to be part of it. You headed the Mercator. Is it called
Mercatus?
Mercatus, yeah. Meaning market, I guess, within the George Mason University. Talk a little bit about the role you are playing in seeding ideas and concepts, starting with academia.
Sure. Well, I'll go back to the Mercatus Center, where I was fortunate to work for 14 years, ran it for the last 10 that I was there. And I think of Mercatus, and I think a lot of the university programs that we support as embodying this notion of a republic of science. And so when we think of a republic of science, we think of bringing a diversity of perspectives, people and approaches, methods all together to address problems that matter to people in society. And that's what Mercatus was all about. And it was fascinating when you brought that kind of a group together to address a problem, how much progress you could make. Indulge me just with one example. My first project at Mercatus, way back in 2000 when I started, was to work with a guy named Doug North. Douglas North was an economics professor at Washington University, won the Nobel Prize back in the 90s. And our project at Mercatus was to work with Doug on what he thought was going to be his last book. It turned out to be his second to last book. He always had more to do than he thought when he started. And Doug said to me, as we were putting together these manuscript workshops on his book, he said, look, we got to put about 15 or 16 people together in the room to help me really improve this manuscript. And he said, my one goal, I want to be the dumbest person in the room. And this is Doug North, right? It's a tall order. He's a pretty smart guy. But what he meant by that was, I don't want to be surrounded by people who think the same way that I do, or that know the same things that I've known, or have experienced the same things that I've experienced. I want to be in a room with people who can teach me something and that I can learn from. Because, well, as we bring all of our ideas together, my ideas are going to get better. And this was a 10-year process that Doug went through. We joined him for the last 3 years of this, and it was fascinating. And so when I think of Mercatus, I think Mercatus embodies that approach in everything that they do. And I certainly learned a lot from that. And that's when we're fortunate to support professors, and we support well over 1,000 professors, about 370 universities across the country. When professors come to us with ideas, and they approach it with that kind of intellectual humility, that's one of the things that we get excited about.
Now, what you do get some pushback, or let me put it differently. Some academics say, well, gee, under the guise of ideological pluralism, some philanthropists will come in and try to promote an idea that is otherwise not sustainable, right? It can be demonstrated to be, not so good. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, I'd say, tell me what if we're supporting ideas that aren't viable, I want to know.
You want to know.
I don't want to be supporting them either. So would you let me in on that?
I'll let you in. Well, I think the thing that's most visible, but this is not so much, is the notion of climate change, and sort of is there a uniform view? If the majority of scientists feel this way, is a minority view really of equal weight? That would be.
And there's a lot of misinformation out there about our support for university programs. Climate change is actually not an area that we've made almost any investments in at the university level, because we haven't really seen an opportunity to make a difference, to add value to that conversation. We've supported some programs. We supported a project at Berkeley called Berkeley Earth, with a wonderful physicist named Richard Mueller, whose work demonstrated that once you get rid of all the noise, there's a relationship between carbon in the air and greenhouse gases and warming. So we contributed to that project, but that was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We haven't done much since. The one thing that all of our programs at universities have in common is they're always faculty driven. Mm-hmm. And so it's not up to us to decide which ideas ought to be supportable or sort of rise to the top. We want to empower faculty members who have a newer, a different way of approaching a societal problem, and then provide them with the resources so they can realize that vision. And we've gone one step further, actually. I think we're the only major foundation out there that publishes our major university grants online. And we do that because we've received feedback from the faculty that we work with that when they can find out about cutting-edge work or what's happening in other universities that they're interested in, they value that. So they can come together with those faculty members at other universities, or they can come to us or other foundations and say, hey, I didn't realize people were supporting this work. We'd love to participate. Great example of that, we were just talking backstage, is the project at Harvard and MIT. I think maybe, and you guys can correct me because many of you support universities, I think maybe it's the best postdoc out there in political science right now. But it's the chance to spend a year at Harvard and a year at MIT, a 2-year postdoc, studying foreign policy. And the project was brought to us by 2 professors, one at Harvard, one at MIT, and they said, look, we don't know what foreign policy should look like going forward, but we're confident that we can do better, and so we'd like to bring in some of the best and the brightest minds to figure out the answer. And that's the best programs, right? I mean, if you start with an answer, why would you support the research?
Mm-hmm. So let me take you back to support for research within academia, but also think tanks. You helped create the Cato Institute, Heritage as well. Is that true? No. But just Cato, and of course your program.
Mercatus, yeah.
Mercatus, yeah. I'll get this by just about the end of our interview. I'll get it down. So Latin was not my strength, just in case you're wondering. But in these cases, they, like all Washington, D.C. think tanks, they're feeding knowledge into the policy process. Cato really, I guess that was started probably in the 1980s or maybe 77, and their influence was significant in the Reagan administration, for example. Various sort of approaches to taxes, to deregulation, to sort of smaller government was very much a theme of Ronald Reagan. It actually didn't get smaller, but it was an aspiration.
It grew almost second. Whoever's president, it's over history, it's grown about the same rate.
That's right.
Whoever's in charge.
That's right. Well, I've just never seen so many deputy assistant secretaries as in the Reagan administration. There was a tremendous proliferation there. There was another organization that came up, I think, in the early 80s, and that's the Federalist Society. And Brad Smith mentioned this on our first night, is how singularly successful it has been, a real example of strategic philanthropy. But it starts with the seeding of ideas. I mean, this is a network of legal scholars and practitioners that have a sort of shared view of the approach to the Constitution, that it would be a kind of originalist view of the Constitution. What we were told is that, 4 out of 5 of the Supreme Court justices either were members or are members. I think I've got that right.
I don't know.
You would know.
And but let me just say what Brad noted, and I thought this was a powerful, important point. The supporters of the Federalist Society have given general operating grants. They haven't said, tied the organization down to projects and then put them in a situation of having to scramble for fundraising to pay for their overhead. As you think about your own philanthropy, how important has it been to think long-term, to be patient about the results, but also to give a lot of freedom to your grantees? You find somebody smart, you find them with a great idea, you fund them, you let them go.
Well, that's in fact what we, as Brian described, what we do in all the university programs. I mean, matter of fact, when I started in doing this, or in parts of this in 1963, it was first some of the ideas that we've talked about. I was applying them and talking about them, so I'd see students who were interested in them, and I'd provide scholarships for them, and then a professor or teacher who saw these kids then say, well, I'd like to do work in this area, so I started supporting them, and so it's proliferated into what would you say, 370 universities?
Yeah, that's right.
Where we support professors in various ways.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example maybe of where this sort of philanthropy plays out, and it's in the area of criminal justice reform.
Yeah.
So there's a project at Arizona State University, a guy named Eric Luna, a law professor that we met maybe 4 or 5 years ago at an event that we hosted for several hundred people in New Orleans on criminal justice. And he came to us and he said, you know, there's been a sea change in the academic understanding of what it means to administer a good criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And it's gone from kind of breaking the paradigm between tough on crime and soft on crime, which is sort of a no-win choice, to smart on crime. So there are ways for us to administer a criminal justice system that really help to protect public safety while giving people the opportunity to improve their lives. And the academics kind of know this. And the policymakers who know it, they know it because they've experimented and they've found good ways to improve their criminal justice system, but it's very dispersed. So you don't have a set of common best practices that are actually being implemented in the policy process. But the work is there to inform it. And so Eric's a guy that saw an opportunity to bring all of the long-term investments in scholarship that many people have been making over the years, including the Koch Foundation, together in a way that could actually bring that kind of knowledge to bear in a way that could improve people's lives. And so today, if you want to know what is the state of the art on criminal justice reform, whether it's prosecutorial discretion reform, bail reform, sentencing reform, reentry programs, you don't have to be, lucky to be in a jurisdiction that has the experience with that. You can go to Eric's project at Arizona State University, which the Koch Foundation, in partnership with several other donors, has helped Eric to create. And you can read, not just from Eric's scholarship, but literally from over 100 different scholars from universities across the country on the state of the art. And none of that's possible without philanthropists, including Charles, but many others, having made those long-term investments in people who had that sort of entrepreneurial spark, that intellectual entrepreneurial spark, where they said, I'm sure there's a better way to do this. I don't yet know what it is, but if you'll support my research, I'm passionate about trying to discover something that can help the world.
Yeah. So when I look at your sort of systems approach to things, it is this combination of seeding ideas. It is connecting those ideas to policy. It is forming, and this is where you started this conversation, on a grassroots movement. I think you refer to it as a seminar network, but it is a movement of donors, of you name it. It's a real combination of people, and there's a mentoring relationships within that. Mm-hmm. And I think back to what David Brooks had to say about relationships are what change minds or advance progress. And then finally, though, what is most visible to the public, or what the public notices most, and the media notices most, is political donations as well. I'm going to pick one example, and then we're going to go back to your criminal justice reform. You were not a big Trump supporter.
No. In all the years I've been involved, in the 55 years I've been involved in these activities, we only supported one presidential candidate, and that was Mitt Romney. And it's because he did so many things in his private life to help people. Yeah. We thought, and then he didn't campaign very well. He didn't campaign on these values that we think he held.
Yeah, he does indeed hold, yes.
Yeah, so he had some bad campaign advice or something.
So you and he then had the same view of Donald Trump. I know that Mitt Romney...
I'm not. My deal is to hate the sin, not the sinner. We want to help save the sinner, right?
So the reason I'm mentioning this is it's back to influence and the importance of bringing ideas into processes, to the people who are going to execute on those ideas. Here was a candidate you didn't support, and yet the sort of social change that you've achieved, or the change in political culture that you've achieved, means that still the kinds of policies we're seeing are consonant with your views. That is to say, tax reform, deregulation, let me think of another, help me, Brian. But there's judicial
criminal
appointments.
justice is a great example, right? I mean, this is the most consequential reform to the criminal justice system in literally a generation since the crime.
And the hope, there's still hope for immigration reform.
We're going to move to that.
But this has been true for ever since we started. I mean, we did not. I mean, people today put everything in terms of the network. We started that in 2003, and I started in this in 1963. So that was 40 years that I had nothing to do with this. Well, we were working on policies and mobilizing, but nothing even touching electoral politics.
Right. So here you have an enormous issue, mass incarceration, particularly of young men, but also young women in our country. And you seized on this issue. It became a central and important issue for you. Tell me why, but also tell me, who were your partners? How did you find them? This was a great example of folks from across the political spectrum working toward a similar goal, or the same goal.
Well, as I said, when I found out where I had ability, it was in a narrow range. And so in my whole life, for me to accomplish anything, I had to get partners who were good at all the things I wasn't. So, and that is a lot of things. And when I found that, I tend to be successful. And when I wasn't able to put that together, I haven't been. And so my philosophy on good partnerships is it requires three things. It requires shared vision, shared values, and having complementary capabilities. And I think what's made us so much more successful in the last 5 years than I had been previously is we have narrowed our definition of a shared vision in this social change work. And we've narrowed it down to we just need to share a vision on this issue. Before, for many years I had, okay, we don't need to agree on everything, but we need to agree on quite a few things. Now, if you will work with us on this one important issue and you bring complementary capabilities and we agree with the methodology, we share values, then we'll work together. Yep. And I think that's what's made all the difference. I don't know what you feel on that, Brian.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it goes back to partnership, right? And so if you really understand what it means to be true partners, and what Charles just went through is the way that we treat a partnership, we both bring something to the table, and we're all trying to get to the same goal. We bring different ways of thinking about it and different approaches. We're going to be able to accomplish a lot more together than we could be on our own.
So as you looked at...
Let me just say one more thing on that when we look at what we're doing, as with a lot of things, we're coming closer to what I think one of the great social entrepreneurs in our history, Frederick Douglass' philosophy was on this. I'll unite with anybody to do right and no one to do wrong. So that's kind of where we've ended up after the long journey and a lot of missteps.
And this has been, if I might, this has been a sea change in the way that we look at the opportunity to engage in the political process as well. And so while most organizations, and certainly we did for a number of years, look at the opportunity in politics as a partisan opportunity, right? You bet on the team that's closest to what you want to accomplish, and then you try to work with them to get things done. A couple of years ago, we looked at that and said, while that's gotten some things done, it's not accomplishing near enough for the country, and it's having all sorts of negative consequences in terms of alienation and polarization. And so based on this philosophy, let's unite with anyone to do right, no one to do wrong, we said we can do better than that. We've stopped engaging in a partisan way in politics, and now we are working to unite broad-based coalitions around public policy. I think that gets to your question on what happened recently in criminal justice, but it also is relevant to immigration, K-12 education, all these other opportunities.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the point you brought earlier. Okay, are you short-term focused or long-term? We are very, as I said, I've been doing this 55 years, and that's what's made us successful in business, is being long-term. And when you get in politics, it's short-term. It's about the next election. And so you elect some people and you think they're going to, and then there are all sorts of perverse secondary consequences from that. So we say we've got to back off from that and go back to, okay, long-term, what's going to move us in the direction that's in harmony with my North Star and what we all agree.
Yeah.
We'd love to see society move.
I can think of very few issues that more clearly speak to whether we're supporting people to realize their potential and whether or not than criminal justice. The idea of incarcerating people, then put them in the situation after they've paid their dues to society, a situation where they can't find housing, can't find a job, might even be denied their right to a vote. So,
well, and it even goes back earlier than that. I mean, if you're selling pot or something, and you know you're going to get 20, 30 years, you run, you may get in a gunfight. Whereas if you had a reasonable penalty of some kind, if there needs to be any, then you won't risk your life. But now we're turning minor misdeeds into draconian situations, not only for their life but for society. So the system today is not making people safer by being tougher. It's making communities less safe.
Yeah. And I think in many ways, Brian keeps hoping I'll go to immigration, which I will now, because in many ways it's a similar set of problems. When and it's, your own values-based response to it is similar, because these are people who have the potential to add so much to our society, to our economy, and yet if treated badly, you've undermined their future as well. You were leaning for it.
Well, I like to, as I say, one thing I'm good at is abstract concepts. So what are the abstract concepts here? And people ask me, what's my position on immigration? And I say I would let everybody in who comes here to contribute, and no one who wants to come here to do harm. And see how easy this is?
But it's hard to tell the difference, isn't it?
That's right. Well, that's another question. But I mean, this goes to our whole philosophy of openness. You have to have, if we want a society that has these virtues, we have to have an open society, be open to ideas, people, goods and services, to learn from each other and have us all benefit.
Yeah. So there are two issues. One is the dreamers, people who are kids who are brought here as children by their parents illegally, and the question is, can they have a legal status? Can they have a pathway to citizenship? That's one set of issues. And the other is, they come together, but they can be dealt with separately, is the concept of comprehensive immigration reform. What has stood in the way? What are the politics of immigration reform, or of both issues, have you found, Charles?
Well, I mean, I think it's once again this the political nature of the dynamics is both parties. They both may agree that we need this change, or not everybody, but by and large, we need these changes in policy to help people improve their lives, but they think it'll help the other party more, so they won't do it. And so we can't make any progress on policies that the great majority of the American people and even the majority of the politicians agree would be the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So it gets in this political dynamic of this win-lose as opposed to what we want of society that's win-win.
So the Freedom Caucus on the Hill, are they, and that sort of stems from the Tea Party, if I understand it correctly, have they stood in the way of immigration reform, or do you need an approach that works better for them? What are the politics of this?
I go back to what David Brooks said in the last panel, that the opportunity here is to, for a small group of people probably, to demonstrate what good looks like here, and for the rest of us to copy them, right? And so that's kind of what we're focused on, and that's, I think, what the opportunity is on immigration. And so I think a lot of different people in public policy, in Congress, in the community, are waiting to see what they can do. And I think the way that we're looking at it is we have an opportunity, again, to unite people of good faith, of different perspectives on the issue of immigration and show that path forward. When you look at the numbers, I mean, people here know the numbers as well as I do. The vast majority of Americans believe what is true, and that is that immigration is good. Right? Our country has benefited from it. It's kind of the secret sauce of our country, right? Immigrants have made us the country we are. Our future depends on doing that going forward.
I guess what I'm asking is there a connection between those polls that show majorities and the political process once this gets on the Hill? Does a member of Congress say to themselves, well, gee, 80% of the public wants this, so I'll do it? Or does that member of Congress say, actually, the folks who voted for me in the primary have pressed me to do it? So we've got sort of structural impediments to collaborate.
That's right. And I think it's a hard task for sure, but it's not nearly impossible. And again, I go back to what's worked. The model of criminal justice reform in this case is the model, I think, and that we're working for on issues like immigration.
Yep.
So literally up until the week before the First Step Act passed in December, we were getting calls saying this thing is dead.
This thing is dead?
This thing is dead. It's not going to pass, right? And why did it pass? Well, I think a lot of people deserve a lot of credit. People, again, of good faith from different perspectives. But a big reason why it passed, I think, and this gets to your question, how do you overcome this political inertia, is because we had this broad coalition and a number of different people who could call up the people that were tentative or hesitant and say, hey, it's going to be okay, I got your back. So we worked hand in hand with Van Jones, with the ACLU, with many other people of good faith who come from more of a progressive point of view. We also worked hand in hand with people like the Texas Public Policy Foundation, members of the White House, and people like Senator Mike Lee, who are about as conservative as they come, and they were able to do that as well for the people that were tentative. And so what you get is what is called a policy cascade. Right, where up until that last minute, it looks like an intransigent issue. It looks like an issue that the loggerheads are going to prevail, and all of a sudden you get 87 senators voting for it. And how does that happen?
Yeah.
You give them permission to do the right thing by showing them that there's a broad base of support that's got their back. And I think that's the opportunity on immigration. It's a tragedy that it's gotten to this point. But the opportunity is for all of us to come together and create that permission for people to do the right thing.
Yeah. So let me actually, because you mentioned the ACLU, my understanding is that the Koch Institute have joined forces with the ACLU and others on this whole issue in Washington, this effort to, in fact, demand that protesters, sort of activists in Washington, pay the Park Service for the litter that results or whatever, but that there's also, we're contemplating limits about where people could protest. So you took a stance on this along with ACLU.
I don't know.
We did. We did.
Believe me, they don't check with me on it.
We're bringing you together.
Just the philosophical issues.
It's right in line with the North Star. It really, it truly.
It's called the division of labor by comparative advantage.
This is breaking news. You've read your clips, right? This is yesterday.
Yes, this is yesterday.
That's right. We co-signed a letter with the ACLU and then NAACP, just making the point that, look, our society depends on creating the space for different ideas, different perspectives to come together peaceably and really have it out. And if you can't do that in front of the White House, or if you're relegated to a strip of sidewalk in front of the White House, or frankly, if government agencies, no matter who's in charge, have the ability to charge arbitrary fees that are really barriers to preventing people from peaceably assembling and having a rigorous exchange of ideas, I mean, you know, who are we as a country?
Right.
And so, yeah, these are easy actions to take in league with wonderful partners who share vision, values, and we bring complementary capabilities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when it came to criminal justice reform, your partners were, I mean, in the funding community, I don't know if Ford was in that, tell us just who were, Hewlett, what were the foundations that ended up partnering?
Look, if I start to list, you know, I'll forget somebody that played an important role. I think, you know, the Arnold Foundation certainly had a significant voice in this, those that you mentioned for sure. Wonderful partners, people like the Deason Foundation, for instance, out of Texas. Again, I don't want to start to list people because I'll miss them, but
it's like the Academy Awards up here. So.
Only not quite as glitzy, right? Yeah.
I didn't wear the right dress, I can tell you that.
But the point, but isn't it wonderful that we can't list everyone? I mean, this is the point. It's such a significant group, and here's the thing.
And then you can go back to them on other issues because you've had that experience and the trust that's built.
You got it.
So okay, for the folks in this audience, the opportunity is immigration reform, is the opportunity citizenship for dreamers. Are these the next two issues that you'll be focusing on?
Well, I mean, there's one other. It's a combination. I think it's so corrosive in our country, and that is cronyism, corporate welfare, protectionism. When I say protectionism, I'm not just talking about nationwide, but individuals and organizations. And I think this is driven by just what we talked about by this short-termism, that so many companies are focused on their short-term profit rather than creating long-term value. So this increases, this isn't blanket, but this increases the tendency to rig the system rather than to create virtuous cycles of mutual benefit, to create real value and succeed by doing that. And what these cause is, well, they push us in general to a two-tiered society, but they undermine innovation, competition, and opportunity for those who start with nothing. So progress in general, and to me, it's suicidal for business. For people to support, the public to support business and business succeeding, they've got to run the business so it benefits the people. You can't just have it benefit a small group and then take advantage of everybody else. So this isn't, people say, well, that's utopian, that's idealistic. No, it isn't. It's practical. I mean, I hope it's idealistic. I hope they're good ideas. And that's why we oppose all of these boondoggles, all of this corporate welfare, protectionism, whether it makes us money or not. For example, on this, what the Republicans were pushing in Congress, this border adjustment tax would have made us over $1 billion a year. Mm-hmm. And guess how? By increasing the cost of goods to the Walmart buyers.
Right.
Are you all crazy? How is this good for the country? And that's what we want, a program that makes Koch Industries a lot of extra money by exploiting other people? This is suicide. Mm-hmm. And so that's the advantage of having a long-term view. Yeah. We don't have anybody checking our quarterly earnings.
I was going to say, having a private corporation.
Absolutely. We want this company to exist and prosper for decades to come, and so we take that view. But I mean, I would take it anyway, just because I'm kind of a maniac.
So let me just close with one issue. I mean, you are very much shaped by the thinking of our founders. back in the 1700s, and the thinking of Adam Smith. I mean, Declaration of Independence and Wealth of Nations pretty much had the same publication date or whatever.
Well, don't forget his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Yeah.
That's I even like that better.
You liked it better. Okay, you got your reading list, folks. One of the things that George Washington said, which I found most compelling. I've never met George Washington, but reading it I found most compelling.
But I'm older, so I have.
You could, yeah.
In spirit.
It turns out that
Some part of his spirit.
And it turns out that wooden teeth were that a guy named Wooden made the teeth. I thought that George, okay. So one of the things he said is that the policy-making process should be a process of with a cup of tea, pouring the hot tea from saucer to cup, from cup to saucer, back and forth between the House and the Senate, so that passions cool, or your tea cools, and then wisdom prevails. I was struck this morning when I read the news by President Trump pulling back his idea of focusing on Obamacare quickly and wait instead until there is a Republican majority in both houses. Under Barack Obama, there was a very significant reliance on executive orders as opposed to going through the political process. So, successive presidents have found ways to avoid doing the hard work of political compromise, the hard work of building a consensus. Is this one of the things that you would like to see happen? In other words, a reduction in the polarization that we may have all contributed to, so that over the long term we can govern and govern effectively.
Well, as you know, my thing is all based in fundamental principles, and when I look at we were supposed to be a country that was founded on the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that is, equal rights, and applied in a way that everybody could follow their own dream, as long as it didn't violate the rights of others in the pursuit of happiness. I put it in the pursuit of fulfillment, or fulfilling their nature, and so on. And the extent to which those principles were followed made us the most successful country in history. And the extent they were violated has caused every problem we have, because you look back at our history and the, of course, terrible consequences up to today. The African Americans had no rights. Native Americans had no right. Women only had partial rights, and people think, oh, that was just the right to vote. People don't realize that women weren't allowed to go to universities or college, and they had almost no rights versus their husband. And then certain immigrants only had partial rights. And there was cronyism and protectionism from the beginning, all of which violated the principles in the Declaration of Independence. So when you think in terms of concepts the way I do, you go back and see that. And so we need a system that will go back and live that, make that come to life, so we have a true society of mutual benefit.
Yeah. So let me just close by saying that Brian and I have gotten to know each other a little bit. The foundation headquarters are based right across the river from Washington, D.C., and we've had the chance to interact. And one of the things he said to me was, my mandate, my job, is to find ways to collaborate across the ideological spectrum. That's your job now. And so I just urge folks in the audience to think about, what are those issues? The Koch Foundation works on persistent poverty domestically. What are those issues on which you may see eye to eye? You may, as a matter of tactical matter, achieve your objectives because you've entered into what you might consider to be unusual partnerships. That's a little bit of the pouring of the tea from cup to saucer, but just leave you with that thought. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I guess we go this way, please.
Ooh, ooh. Ooh, okay. Ooh. We're just sound checking, so thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying the sound check. Ooh, ooh. Paul and Silas are bound in jail, had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on that prize. Hold on. You know you got to hold on. Yes, hold on. Keep your eyes on that prize. Hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. Doors all open and they all walked out. Keep your eyes on that prize. Hold on, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on that prize. Hold on. You know you gotta hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on that prize. Hold on now. Only chains that we can stand are the chains of hand in hand. Keep your eyes on that prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, oh, you got to hold on. Yeah, hold on. told me, hold on. My mama told me, hold on. Grandmother told me to hold on. No matter, no matter, no matter, no matter what happens, hold on. Thank you. Khalil Doak Anthony on guitar. My name is Tiffany Austin. Thank you so much for the wonderful work you're all doing. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.